The stars belonged to the Vaxorians, and everyone knew it. For 3,000 years, their empire had spread across the galaxy like a shadow that swallowed light. They were giants among the stars, standing 12 feet tall with scales that could turn away bullets and claws that could tear through steel doors. Their warships moved between worlds, bringing a simple message to every species they found: surrender or die. Most chose surrender, because choosing death meant watching your world burn from orbit, while Vaxorian soldiers landed to claim whatever remained. Commander Zorothka stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching another world fall. The Dalarians had built their civilization underwater on a planet covered in deep oceans. They were gentle creatures with silver skin and large eyes that reflected starlight. They had art and music and poetry that spoke of peace and harmony with all living things. They also had no weapons worth mentioning, and no army that could stand against even a single Vaxorian soldier. When Zorothtik's fleet appeared in their sky, the Dalarian leaders took exactly 4 hours to send their surrender. It was actually longer than most species lasted, and Zorothtik found himself almost respecting them for taking that long to accept the inevitable. He watched the display screens as Vaxorian dropships descended toward the ocean world. The Dalarians would be given new laws to follow and taxes to pay. Their children would learn Vaxorian history in schools and be taught that the Empire had brought them civilization. In a generation or two, they would barely remember what freedom felt like. This was how it always went, and this was how it always would go. Because no species in the known galaxy could match Vaxorian strength. They had tried, of course, because hope dies slowly even when it should die fast. The Korvath had tried resisting 70 years ago with their advanced energy shields. The shields held for 6 days before Vaxorian soldiers simply dug under the shield generators and destroyed them from below. The Menturi had tried hiring mercenaries from a dozen different worlds to fight for them. The mercenaries took one look at the Vaxorian armada and fled without firing a shot. Resistance was pointless and surrender was inevitable in the Empire. Grew larger with each passing year, Zorothtik turned away from the displays, feeling the familiar emptiness that came after every easy conquest. There was no glory in crushing those who could not fight back. His ancestors had fought worthy enemies and won battles that seemed impossible. He commanded fleets that faced nothing but frightened prey. Still, he served the Empire because serving the Empire was what warriors did, and questioning the Emperor was what dead warriors did shortly before they died, far across the galaxy on a small blue. The world that no Vaxorian had ever heard of, something new was happening. Humans called their planet Earth, and they had just figured out how to break the laws of physics that kept them. They're trapped in their own solar system. The scientists said it was impossible, and then the engineers built it anyway, because humans had a habit of doing impossible things when someone told them it could not be done. The ship was called the Horizon, and it was not much to look at compared to the massive warships that the Vaxorians flew between stars. It was small and cramped and held together with welds that the engineers promised would hold but everyone else worried about. During the quiet hours of the night, Captain Jake Morrison sat in the command chair running through the pre-flight checklist for the 100th time. He was a career military officer who had commanded atmospheric fighters before volunteering for the space program. His hair was starting to show gray at the temples, and his hands had the steady calm of someone who had flown through storms that would have killed lesser pilots. Next to him sat Amy Chen, who had logged more simulation hours than any other pilot in the program. She had quick reflexes and a sharp mind and a tendency to hum old rock songs when she was nervous. Behind them, Ben Parker hunched over the engineering station, muttering to himself as he checked power levels and fuel consumption rates. Ben could fix anything given enough time and spare parts and coffee. He ran on coffee the way the ship ran on reactor fuel. Lisa Rodriguez occupied the science station surrounded by displays, showing everything from stellar radiation to gravitational fluctuations. She had 3 doctoral degrees and spoke 5 languages and had a laugh that made everyone around her smile. Danny Walsh stood near the airlock, checking weapons that everyone hoped they would never need to use. He was built like a brick wall and had the kind of calm presence that made people feel safer just knowing he was there. Together, they were humanity's first crew to leave the solar system, and none of them quite believed it was really happening until the countdown reached 0 and the engines fired and Earth fell away behind them. The mission was simple in theory and complicated in practice. They would travel to a nearby star system and look for planets and scan for signs of life and take lots of readings that scientists back home would spend years analyzing. If they found other intelligent life, they were supposed to make peaceful contact and exchange greetings and establish friendly relations. There were protocols for first contact that had been written by diplomats and linguists and philosophers. Jake had read all of them and thought they were probably useless because protocols written in comfortable offices never survived contact with actual reality. Still, they would try their best because humans had been dreaming of meeting aliens for centuries, and nobody wanted to mess it up by accidentally starting a war. The horizon jumped too faster than light speed, and the universe twisted around them in ways that human eyes were not meant to see. Amy kept her hands steady on the controls and her eyes on the instruments, because looking at the distorted starfield made her head hurt. The jump lasted 17 seconds and covered 12 light years, and when they dropped back to normal space, they were farther from home than any human had ever been. Lisa immediately started scanning everything, while Ben checked the engines to make sure they had not exploded or melted or done any of the other terrible things that experimental engines sometimes did. Everything looked good, and everyone let out breaths they had not realized they were holding. They spent 2 days exploring the system and finding nothing but rocks and gas giants and cosmic dust. It was disappointing, but not unexpected, because most star systems were empty of life. Jake was about to order the jump home when Amy picked up something on the sensors. There was a ship nearby, and it was big, and it was moving toward them fast. Lisa tried scanning it, but her instruments could not penetrate its hull. Danny moved to the weapons station without being asked, because his instincts were telling him something was wrong. The alien ship was 3 times the size of the horizon and covered in angular armor plating. It matched their velocity and position with casual ease. Then a transmission came through in a language that the computer could not translate, but the tone needed no translation. It was a demand and a threat wrapped into one. Jake tried responding with greetings in 12 different human languages. The alien ship responded by firing a bolt of energy that passed 50 meters from their hull. It was a warning shot, and everyone on the bridge knew it. Jake had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision that would change everything. The alien ship hung in space like a predator waiting to see if its prey would run or fight. Amy's hands were tight on the controls, and Ben was shouting something about power levels, and Lisa was trying to get any kind of reading on the alien vessel's weapon systems. Danny had already armed the Horizon's defensive batteries, which were designed for shooting asteroids in space debris, but could probably hurt something living if they had to. Jake thought about his orders and his training and all those protocols about peaceful first contact. Then he thought about that warning shot and how the next one probably would not miss. He gave the order to fire. The Horizon's weapons were experimental railguns that used AG's magnetic fields to launch projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. Human engineers had designed them because humans had spent centuries finding better ways to kill each other, and those lessons translated well to space combat. The projectiles crossed the distance in less than a second and struck the alien ship's shields. The shields flared bright blue and then shattered like glass hit with a hammer. The projectiles punched through the hull and out the other side, leaving molten metal in their wake. Alarms started screaming on the alien ship, and it turned away fast and jumped faster than light speed before Jake could even process what had just happened. The bridge of the Horizon was silent, except for the sound of people breathing hard. Amy looked at her hands like she did not recognize them. Ben stared at his displays showing weapon power consumption and hull integrity. Lisa pulled up the sensor recordings and played them back 3 times, trying to understand what her instruments had just witnessed. Danny was the first one to speak, and he said what everyone was thinking. Those shields should not have failed that easily. Nothing humanity had ever built had broken through energy shields on the first hit. The aliens had shields that looked impressive, but performed like wet paper, and that did not make any sense at all. Jake ordered Amy to plot a jump back to Earth, but the navigation computer was showing errors. The earlier warning shot had not missed by accident. It had clipped their sensor array and damaged the systems they needed for accurate, faster-than-light jumps. Ben said he could fix it, but he needed time and parts and more coffee than they had on board. They were stuck in an alien star system after shooting at an alien ship, and their way home was broken. Jake sent a tight beam transmission toward Earth, explaining what had happened and asking for instructions. The response would take days to arrive because even moving at light speed, messages took time to cross the galaxy. Commander Zaratha received the emergency transmission from the patrol ship and did not believe a word of it. The patrol captain claimed that an unknown vessel had destroyed their shields with a single volley and that they had barely escaped with their lives. Zrothtek had heard excuses from failed commanders before. They always blamed their defeats on impossible enemies and unexpected weapons and bad luck. The truth was usually that they had been drunk or lazy or cowardly. Still, the patrol ship's sensors had recorded the encounter, and when Zrothtek reviewed the footage, he felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt uncertainty. The unknown ship was tiny compared to Vaxorian vessels. It had no visible armor and no obvious weapons ports. It looked like something a primitive species would build for their first attempts at leaving their home world. But those projectile weapons had torn through military-grade shields like they were nothing at all. Zrothtek played the footage again, watching the shields collapse and the hull breach and the patrol ship flee. He thought about his ancestors, who had fought worthy enemies and won impossible battles. Perhaps he would finally get his chance to prove himself against someone who could actually fight back. He assembled a battle fleet of 50 warships and set course for the coordinates where the patrol ship had encountered the unknown vessel. His officers were excited because they had heard the rumors and wanted to see this new species for themselves. Sarathge gave them orders to capture the unknown ship intact if possible. The Emperor would want to study their weapons and find out how such a small vessel had managed to break Vaxorian shields. If capture proved impossible, then destruction would be acceptable. Either way, the unknown species would learn that challenging the Vaxorian Empire led to only one outcome. Back on the horizon, Ben worked around the clock trying to repair the navigation systems. The damage was worse than he initially thought because the alien weapon had melted several critical components. He could replace them, but it would take time and jury-rigging and more creative engineering than he had ever attempted. Amy helped by holding tools and fetching parts and making sure Ben actually ate something occasionally. Lisa continued analyzing the data from the encounter, and her conclusions were troubling. The alien technology was advanced in some ways, but primitive in others. Their shields operated on principles that human scientists understood well. Their weapons were basic energy projection systems. Their ship moved fast, but not as fast as the Horizon could move. She ran simulations, and each one told her the same thing. Humanity had accidentally developed weapons and defenses that were superior to whatever the aliens possessed. Danny did not care about the technical details. He cared about the fact that they were stranded in hostile territory with damaged systems and limited supplies. He checked and rechecked their weapons inventory and trained with the small arms they had on board. If aliens tried to board the Horizon, he would make them regret it. Jake spent his time reviewing their options and preparing contingency plans. If they could not fix the navigation system, they might have to try conventional slower-than-light travel to reach the nearest star system. It would take decades, but the ship had cryogenic systems that could keep them alive. If aliens showed up in force, they would have to decide whether to fight or surrender. Jake had already decided they would fight because surrendering to species that fired without attempting communication seemed like a bad idea. 3 days after the first encounter, Amy picked up multiple contacts on the sensors. 50 alien warships dropped out of faster-than-light speed in a formation that surrounded the Horizon. They were massive vessels covered in weapons and armor. Lisa estimated each one massed 100 times more than the Horizon. Ben abandoned his repairs and rushed to give the weapons every bit of power he could squeeze from the reactors. Danny locked down the ship's interior and armed himself with everything they had. Jake opened a communication channel and tried one last time to explain that humans came in peace and wanted to talk. The response was 50 warships, opening fire at once. The battle lasted 17 minutes, and when it was over, 42 Vaxorian warships were drifting hulks, leaking atmosphere and bodies into the void. The horizon had taken damage, but nothing that Ben could not patch with enough time and enough cursing at stubborn machinery. Jake sat in his command chair feeling numb because he had just killed thousands of beings and he had no idea if they had families or dreams or reasons to live beyond following orders. Amy was shaking and Lisa was crying quietly at her station, and Danny looked like he wanted to hit something but had nothing left to hit. The 8 surviving Vaxorian ships had jumped away after watching their fleet get torn apart by a single human vessel that should not have been able to do what it just did. Commander Zorothquiz was on one of those surviving ships, and he was bleeding from a dozen wounds where shrapnel had torn through his scales. His flagship was gone, and most of his crew was dead, and his certainty about Vaxorian superiority had died. Somewhere around the 9-minute mark of the battle, he had watched human weapons move faster than his targeting systems could track. He had watched his shields fail, and his armor crumble, and his ships explode one after another. The humans fought like nothing he had ever seen, using tactics that made no sense, until suddenly they made perfect sense, and by then it was too late. They did not fight in formations or follow predictable patterns. They moved like hunters who had learned their craft by being hunted themselves. Zarath sent an emergency transmission on every frequency the Empire used. His message was simple and terrifying. A new species had entered the galaxy, and they were more dangerous than anything the Vaxorians had ever encountered. They needed to be stopped before they decided to do to the Empire what the Empire had done to everyone else. The transmission reached Vaxorian outposts and military bases and government centers across hundreds of star systems. It also reached the species that the Vaxorians had conquered because the Empire had never bothered to encrypt their communications. Why would they, when no one dared to challenge them? On a world of crystalline towers and floating gardens, the Kyrix received the transmission and felt something they had not felt in 3 generations. They felt hope. Ambassador Thelris was old even by Kyrix standards, with a carapace that had turned silver with age and compound eyes that had seen the before times when his people were free. He called an emergency session of the Galactic Council, which was not really a council at all, but a gathering of conquered species forced to administer this Vaxorian law over their own people. They met in a chamber built by the Vaxorians to remind everyone who was in charge, with walls of black metal and seats designed for species much larger than those who sat in them. Thelris played the transmission for everyone to hear. The council chamber erupted in whispers and clicking and sounds of disbelief. The Dalarians, who had just surrendered days ago, asked if this meant they might be freed. The Korvath, who had tried to resist and failed, wanted to know if the humans would come for the Empire. The Menturi, who had given up without fighting, wondered if they should have waited for these powerful allies to appear. Thelris raised his foreleg for silence, and when the chamber quieted, he spoke in the common tongue that all subject species were forced to learn. They needed to make contact with humanity immediately, before the Vaxorians did something desperate. Desperate empires did terrible things, and the Vaxorians had never lost before, which meant they did not know how to lose gracefully. Far away on Earth, President Karen Hughes sat in the situation room reading Jake's report for the 5th time. The words did not change no matter how many times she read them. First contact with alien life had resulted in a battle that killed thousands. The aliens had fired first, and humans had defended themselves, but that would not matter to the aliens who were now missing 42 warships. Admiral Frank Stevens stood nearby, studying tactical displays and making notes about fleet deployments. He wanted to prepare for war because war seemed inevitable now. His entire career had been built on the principle that being unprepared for war was how you lost wars before they even started. Diplomat Helen Martinez argued against military preparations. She said that responding to violence with more violence would confirm whatever the aliens thought about humanity. They needed to send a peaceful mission to explain what happened and try to establish communication. Karen listened to both arguments and made a decision that satisfied neither of them completely. They would send a diplomatic mission led by Helen, but it would be escorted by military vessels. commanded by Admiral Frank's most trusted officer. Commander Chris Taylor would take the warship Liberty and enough firepower to defend the diplomats if things went wrong. If the aliens wanted peace, they would get peace. If they wanted war, they would get something they were not prepared for. The Liberty was 1-0. Earth's newest warships, built with all the lessons learned from centuries of human conflict. It had armor that could withstand direct hits and weapons that could punch through most known materials and engines that could outrun almost anything. Chris Taylor was a career officer who had come up through the ranks and earned respect by being smart and fair and absolutely ruthless when necessary. He picked his crew carefully, choosing people who could think fast and shoot straight and follow orders even when those orders seemed crazy. Helen brought a team of linguists and anthropologists and cultural specialists who had spent their entire lives preparing for first contact, even though none of them had expected it to start with a battle. The Liberty and 2 escort ships left Earth carrying humanity's hopes for peace and preparations for war. They traveled for days, crossing the distance between stars and trying not to think about what might be waiting for them. Helen spent the time studying everything they knew about the Vaxorians, which was almost nothing. Lisa had sent her analysis showing that the alien technology was less advanced than human technology in key areas. Chris spent the time running combat drills because he trusted preparation more than he trusted hope. They reached the coordinates where Jake had encountered the Vaxorian fleet and found nothing but debris. Chris ordered his ships to scan everything while Helen recorded messages in every language Earth knew, trying to establish peaceful contact. What they found instead was a small vessel approaching slowly with its weapons powered down. The vessel transmitted a message in broken English that had clearly been assembled using translation software. It said that Ambassador Thelreese of the Kyrix people requested permission to come aboard and speak with the humans about matters of galactic importance. Helen looked at Chris and Chris looked at his tactical displays. The small vessel carried no weapons and its crew of 3 posed no threat. He gave permission for the ship to dock. Ambassador Thelreese came aboard the Liberty, moving slowly on 6 legs and carrying himself with dignity, despite being a representative of a conquered people. He looked at the humans with eyes that processed light in ways human eyes could not. Then he spoke in careful English that he had learned in the days since receiving the transmission. He told them that the galaxy had been waiting for someone like them. He told them about the Empire and the conquered worlds and the thousands of years of oppression. He told them that 50 species would follow humanity if humans promised to lead them against the Vaxorians. Helen felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. Chris felt his tactical mind already planning campaigns. And somewhere in Vaxorian Space Emperor, Vracaner was assembling an armada of 5,000 warships, because he would not let some unknown species destroy everything his ancestors had built. Emperor Vracanor stood on the bridge of his command ship watching the blue planet grow larger on the displays. Earth looked peaceful from orbit with its white clouds and green continents and vast oceans that reminded him distantly of worlds his ancestors had conquered long ago. The humans had built their civilization on this single world, and now they dared to challenge an empire that spanned 800 star systems. He had brought 5,000 warships to teach them the price of defiance. The armada stretched across space in formations that had crushed resistance on 100 worlds. Victory was certain because victory was always certain when Vaxorians brought overwhelming force. Admiral Frank Stevens watched the Vaxorian armada approach and felt cold. Calculation replaced any fear he might have felt. He had 200 human warships, which seemed pathetic compared to 5,000. But Frank had learned long ago that wars were not won by counting ships. They were won by understanding how to use what you had better than the enemy used what they had. The Vaxorians flew in tight formations like they were on parade. They relied on their shields and armor to absorb damage while they hammered enemies with superior numbers. Frank had studied every second of footage from Jake's encounter and Chris's skirmishes with Vaxorian scouts. He knew their weaknesses now. Helen broadcast one final message from the communications center on Earth's largest space station. She spoke in Vaxorian, which she had learned from Ambassador Thelreese, and she pleaded for the Emperor to stand down and negotiate. She explained that humans did not want war and had only defended themselves when attacked. She offered peace and cooperation and a chance to avoid bloodshed. Emperor Vrakaner heard every word and ignored all of them because empires did not negotiate with species who had killed Vaxorian warriors. Empires made examples and maintained order through fear. He gave the command to attack. 5,000 warships surged forward in wave formations that had terrified countless species into surrender. Frank had positioned his 200 ships in clusters scattered across Earth's orbital space. The Vaxorians expected humans to form defensive lines or try to protect specific locations. Instead, the human ships scattered the moment the attack began. They broke into small groups of 3 or 4 vessels that moved independently using speed and maneuverability that Vaxorian ships could not match. The battle became chaos within minutes because humans fought like they had learned from centuries of warfare against themselves. They used ambush tactics and hit and run strikes and coordinated attacks that came from unexpected angles. Jake and the Horizon joined the battle, along with dozens of other ships that had been built. In the frantic weeks after first contact, Amy flew like her life depended on it, which it absolutely did. She spun the Horizon through debris fields and around larger ships, using them as cover, while Danny fired weapons at any Vaxorian vessel that got too close. Ben rerouted power systems on the fly, sending energy to shields when they needed defense and to weapons when they had clear shots. Lisa analyzed enemy movements and predicted their patterns, allowing Amy to be where the enemy did not expect her to be. The Vaxorians had never fought an enemy like this. Their formations broke apart as human ships darted between them like insects attacking a giant. Their shields held for a while, but human weapons found weak points and exploited them with precision that spoke of scientific understanding rather than brute force. Vaxorian commanders tried to regroup and establish firing lines, but human ships refused to stay still long enough to be targeted effectively. Every time the Vaxorians thought they had trapped a human vessel, it would accelerate away at speeds that made Vaxorian engines look like ancient machinery. Commander Chris Taylor led a strike force of 20 ships against the Emperor's command vessel. The Liberty and its escorts cut through the Vaxorian defensive screen, using tactics that Chris had developed specifically for this moment. They launched drone swarms that the Vaxorians initially ignored because they looked like missiles. But these drones were not missiles. They were intelligent weapons that selected their own targets and coordinated with each other to overwhelm point defense systems. By the time the Vax realized what they were facing, the drones had disabled half the weapons on the command ship. Emperor Vrakaner felt his ship shudder as human weapons tore through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. His officers were shouting conflicting reports about hull breaches and system failures and ships exploding across the fleet. This was not how battles were supposed to go. The Vaxorians were the strongest species in the galaxy, and strength always won, but somehow these humans were winning anyway. He ordered his fleet to focus all fire on the human command ships, but the humans did not have command ships. Every vessel operated independently and made its own decisions and adapted to changing situations faster than Vaxorian command structures could respond. The battle raged for 3 days across Earth's orbital space, and the space around Luna, and even out past Mars. Human ships fought in shifts, rotating back to resupply and repair while fresh crews took their places. The Vaxorians fought until their ships were destroyed because retreat was not part of their military doctrine. By the end of the first day, 1,000 Vaxorian warships had been destroyed. By the end of the second day, that number had doubled. By the end of the third day, Emperor Vrakaner's command ship was surrounded by human vessels, and he had no fleet left to call for rescue. Chris Taylor led a boarding party onto the Vaxorian command ship. They moved through corridors built for beings twice their size, fighting Vaxorian soldiers who were stronger and tougher, but not faster or smarter. Human tactics developed from centuries of urban combat and special operations translated perfectly to shipboarding actions. They used stun grenades and coordinated movements and non-lethal weapons because Chris had orders to capture the Emperor alive if possible. The Vaxorian guards fought with honor and desperation, but they had never trained for fighting inside their own ships because no enemy had ever gotten this far before. Emperor Vrakaner stood in his command chamber, surrounded by his last guards, waiting for the humans to arrive. When Chris and his team breached the door, the Emperor raised his claws ready to die in battle like his ancestors. Chris stunned him with an electrical weapon before he could take 2 steps. The Emperor collapsed, and Chris ordered his team to secure the prisoner and prepare for transport. The mighty Emperor of the Vaxorian Empire was now a captive of a species he had intended to crush. Across the solar system, the remaining Vaxorian ships received word that their Emperor had been captured. Some tried to continue fighting and were destroyed. Others surrendered when they realized the battle was lost. A few fled back toward Vaxorian space carrying news of the defeat. Jake brought the Horizon back to Earth's orbital dock with his crew exhausted but alive. Amy had bruises from the crash harness, and Ben had burns from a console that exploded, and Lisa had gone through 3 packs of stimulants, staying awake to run tactical analysis. Danny had a cut over his eye from debris, but he was smiling because they had survived. Admiral Frank stood in the command center looking at casualty reports and damage assessments. Humanity had lost 78 ships and thousands of crew members. The Vaxorians had lost over 4,000 warships and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The numbers were staggering, and Frank felt no joy in them because winning battles always meant counting the dead afterward. But they had won, and Earth was safe, and the galaxy would never be the same. Ambassador Thelrus watched the battle's end from the observation deck of a human station. He had lived for almost 200 years under Vaxorian rule, believing his people would never be free. Now he watched the impossible happen because these humans had done what no other species could do. They had broken the Empire's military might and captured the Emperor himself. Thelrus felt his legs tremble not from age but from emotion he had thought died long ago. He felt hope burning bright and certain like a star being born. The days after the battle were harder than the battle, like itself in some ways, because winning a war meant deciding what to do with the victory. President Karen Hughes sat in meetings that stretched for hours, while military commanders and diplomats and politicians argued about the future. Admiral Frank wanted to press the advantage and dismantle every Vaxorian military installation before they could regroup. He had reports showing that the Empire still controlled hundreds of systems and commanded millions of soldiers scattered across the galaxy. Leaving them intact meant leaving a threat that could come back stronger. Helen argued that destroying the Empire completely would create a power vacuum that could lead to chaos and civil war across dozens of worlds. The conquered species needed stability, not more violence. Jake and his crew were given medals and promotions and invitations to speak at ceremonies honoring the defenders of Earth. Jake accepted the medals because refusing them would insult the people who died in the battle, but he skipped most of the ceremonies. He spent his time instead visiting the families of crew members who had not come home. Amy went with him because she understood that heroes were just people who survived when others did not. They sat in living rooms and kitchens, talking to parents and spouses and children about the people they had lost. Some families wanted to know every detail of how their loved ones died. Others just wanted to know that their sacrifice mattered. Jake told them all the truth, which was that their family members had saved Earth and changed the galaxy. Forever, Emperor Vrakaner sat in a cell. Designed for holding dangerous prisoners, though, the bars and walls seemed unnecessary now. He had been stripped of his armor and his weapons and his authority. Guards watched him constantly, but he barely noticed them. He spent his time replaying the battle in his mind, trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. The Vaxorians had been the strongest species in the galaxy for 3,000 years. Strength was supposed to be enough. It had always been enough before. But the humans had proven that strength without adaptation was just another word for stagnation. His empire had stopped evolving because it never needed to evolve. Every enemy fell to the same tactics and the same overwhelming force. The humans had forced them to evolve in a matter of days, and by then it was too late. President Karen made her decision after consulting with everyone who had an opinion and many who did not. She would address the galaxy directly using every communications channel that humans could access. Helen helped write the speech, and Ambassador Thelrus helped translate it into the common tongue that most species understood. The broadcast went out on every frequency, reaching worlds that had been conquered and worlds that had never heard of humans, and worlds that were watching nervously to see what these powerful newcomers would do. Next, Karen spoke from the same office where Earth's leaders had announced wars and peace treaties and first contact with alien life. She explained that humanity had not sought conflict with the Vaxorian Empire, but had defended themselves when attacked. She said that humans understood oppression because they had spent much of their history oppressing each other before finally learning better. She proposed the complete dissolution of the Vaxorian Empire and the creation of a true galactic federation where every species had equal representation regardless of their military strength or technological advancement. She promised that humanity would help rebuild worlds damaged by war and would share their technology with any species that wanted it. She also promised that humanity would defend the new federation against anyone who tried to rebuild the old empire. The response came within hours from dozens of worlds. The Kyrix accepted immediately, with Ambassador Thelris speaking for his people. The Dalarians, who had just been conquered weeks ago, announced they were free again and would join the Federation. The Korvath and the Mentorian species that humans had never heard of all sent messages of support. Some messages were cautious and some were enthusiastic, but all of them shared a common theme. They had lived under Vaxorian rule for so long that they had forgotten what freedom felt like. Now they remembered, and they wanted to make sure it lasted. Not everyone was happy with the decision. Some Vaxorian worlds refused to accept that the Empire was over. Some human leaders thought Karen was being too generous with enemies who had tried to destroy. Earth Admiral Frank remained skeptical that peace could last, but he followed orders and began working with other species to create a Federation military that could defend against external threats and internal rebellions. Commander Chris was put in charge of training programs that would teach other species how to fight using human tactics. His first students were reformed Vaxorian officers who had survived the battle and chose to serve the new Federation rather than cling to the old Empire. Helen spent months traveling between worlds helping establish the new government. She met with leaders and diplomats and ordinary people who had questions about how the Federation would work. She listened to concerns about human dominance and promises that sounded too good to be true. She admitted that humans did not have all the answers and would make mistakes along the way. But she also pointed out that the old system had been built on conquest and fear, while the new system would be built on cooperation and mutual benefit. It would take time and effort and probably some failures before they got it right. The important thing was to try. 5 years passed faster than anyone expected. The Galactic Federation grew to include over 90 species from hundreds of worlds. Trade routes opened between systems that had been isolated under Vaxorian rule. Cultural exchanges brought art and music and ideas flowing across the galaxy. Human technology was adapted by species who added their own innovations, creating advancements that no single species could have achieved alone. Lisa became the Federation's chief science advisor, overseeing research projects that involved thousands of scientists from dozens of worlds. Danny trained security forces that included humans and Kyrix, and even some Vaxorians who had embraced the new order. Amy taught at the Federation Academy, showing young pilots from across the galaxy that skill and creativity mattered more than raw power. Jake stood on the bridge of his new ship, watching stars slide past as they traveled toward unexplored regions of the galaxy. The Unity was larger than the horizon and carried a crew of 40 from 8 different species. His first officer was a Kyrix named Kelvin, who had fought in the resistance against Vaxorian occupation. His chief engineer was a human woman named Nicole, who had learned her trade from Ben before he retired to teach at the academy. His pilot was a young Dalarian whose enthusiasm reminded Jake of Amy when she was younger. They were heading into unknown space to explore and make contact with species who had never heard of the Federation or the Empire or the war that changed everything. The mission was simple in theory and probably complicated in practice, just like the first mission had been. They would explore new worlds and meet new species and offer friendship instead of conquest. Some species would accept, and some would be suspicious, and some might even be hostile. But the galaxy had learned an important lesson from humanity's arrival. True strength was not about who could hit the hardest or build the biggest fleet. True strength was about adapting and learning and working together toward common goals. The Vaxorians had been mighty, but they had been alone. Humanity had been small, but they had been willing to change and grow and bring others along with them. Jake looked at his diverse crew, working together on the bridge, and felt something he had not felt since. Before that first encounter with the Vaxorian patrol ship, he felt optimistic about the future. The Age of Empires was over, and the Age of Cooperation had begun. Somewhere in the distant stars, other species were watching humanity's rise and wondering